In this part we'll be making our game model, and we'll be unwrapping our game mesh. Before I begin, I just want you to let you know that I'll be using Zremesher to make my game model, but I just want to tell you guys that if you can, you should definitely make the retopology yourself manually, as it'll help you out later, and it's a better practice if you actually do it yourself. But just for the tutorial purposes here, I'll be using Zremesher in Zbrush, just because I think that most beginners, even if they try to do the retopology themselves, they wouldn't get to good geometry. And the Zremesher is fairly easy to use, and it gives you a pretty decent geometry fairly fast. So yeah, but those who know how to topologize, they'll just do it themselves. But for those who are new to this, you should definitely look into it. And but yeah, so I'll just be using the Zremesher. So let's get started. So before I use the Zremesher, I duplicate my skull and I turn off the poly paint, and then I'll take it down to lowest subdivision. And before I actually use the Zremesher, I'll use the Zremesher guidelines to kinda mark of where I want the topology kinda to be, or how to be. And Zremesher, if you don't do this, you can get pretty bad results. But the more time you spend with the Zremesher guides and the color density painting, I'll show that later, the better result it'll give you actually. And if you really spend time with this, you can get a pretty decent results, and get a pretty decent game mesh. And I typically start with adding these typical lines on the face, around his eye sockets, and around his mouth, ears, and here I'm doing it on the tentacle, as you can see. So you definitely want to think about your topology, the flow of your topology when adding the lines. Where do you want your Zremesher to kinda make the flow of the geometry? So like you see here, I'm adding it to the ears, around this neck there. And then you don't have to be perfect with these, you just want to add a base guide, because your mesh will do the rest, And here I usually also do around the shoulder there, around this armpit, typically also by the elbow, and also adding there by the knife, around the knife. And then I typically add this line that goes along the side, kind of where you would add a seam in the unwrapping, as you can see there. And like I said, you don't have to be perfect with your Zremesher lines. As you can see there, it's pretty messy, but you generally want to spend still some time with it, just so you can get the best result possible with the Zremesher. Around his leg there. So like I said in the beginning, if you know how to retopologize yourself, you should definitely do it, as you'll have a better control of your topology and geometry and your poly count. But most beginners, even if they would do it by themselves, they wouldn't get the best geometry. And at this point, Zremesher would give a lot better geometry. But you should still learn retopologizing yourself. And you can use Blender for that, you can use Maya, but I typically use Zbrush actually, and then I would just take it in Blender and clean it up. That's what I did with my Lucy Ice Monsters. I made the topology myself, but just for the tutorial purposes, since it's aiming mostly towards beginners, I'm just using Zremesher, as it also saves me some time. So you can see here, I'm just And the target poly count, if you set it to 0.7, it's gonna aim towards 7,000 squares, you know. So that's something to think about. And you can play around with the curve strength and adaptive size too. And if you hold Alt actually while clicking Zremesher, you can actually get a different result. So you wanna see which option gives you the best result. So here I'm done with my mesh, and after I done Zremeshing it, or I think I'm done with it, I might readjust a bit. But usually I project my sculpt on top of my Zremesh mesh. And here I'm also doing it for the eyes, taking it to the lowest poly count and just projecting the high poly on top. And here I wasn't satisfied with the geometry, so I, especially with his ears there, so I added extra guidelines in some places, as you can see. And then, you know, I also used the poly paint for density, and that is pretty good if you want more density, let's say on his face, around his ears, and if you want less density, like let's say on his back or something. So I'm just playing around, you know, trying different guidelines and such. Now I'll be using. You want to make your mesh fill it with a material so it actually becomes fully white. So then you can just go in with your color density, poly pinning, and just paint where you want your polygons to be more dense. So that would be typically around this mouth there, or in his ears. But you know, you should spend more time with this. I didn't spend that much. I only used it on his head. But you know, you can use it on his arms. You know, if you go to color density of -1, it'll actually use a lower density. So you usually want to use that around his parts where you don't need that much density of polygons. And at this point, I think I was kind of happy with the result. So I think I just went with it, and then I imported it in Blender to clean it up a bit, to reduce some edge loops. And you know, the thing is, when using Zremesher, it usually gives you quite bad edge loops around parts. But you know, I got a quite decent result this time. So you know, you just want to spend your time with the Zremesher guidelines and the density painting to get the best result possible. And here I'm just selecting edge loops, you know, and deleting them where I don't need them as much. So usually around his belly there, and wherever I can find, like on his knife there. I don't really need that many edge loops there. And as you can see, the Zremesher doesn't give too good edge flow sometimes, so that's one good thing when you're doing the retopology yourself. You actually have better control of your edge flow. But you know, Zremesher works pretty okay, you know, and it gives you pretty good actually animation results and pretty good mesh for what it's supposed to do. As it's just one button click, and you know, it saves a lot of time. But you know, you still want to learn how to do topology yourself. Yeah, this is going to be really useful. So I'm just trying to find some edge loops where I don't need them. And as you can see here, I'm having a hard time since Zremesher gave me quite nasty edge flows or edge loops in some places. So I just tried to reduce the poly count as much as I could. So I think I managed to reduce it by about 2,000 triangles, and it's still quite a lot of polygons for this type of character. No, but you know, that's because I use Zremesher. And, you know, if I would done the topology myself, I probably could have gotten around 8,000, 7,000 polygons, and that would be enough. You know, I didn't bother cleaning up too much, but you know, As you can see here on this blade, some of the vertices are quite bad, and I didn't really bother fixing them. But you should spend as much time as you need to make your mesh perfect. And here I'm adding some edge loops when I need them, because I'm thinking about the animation process where the tentacle is gonna move and such. So I typically would be around this elbow where you want extra edge loops for better joint movement or limb movement when you're animating and weight painting. I think I'll start unwrapping pretty soon. Yep. And when I do that, I usually delete half of the mesh. And to do that, you can just go into orthographic view, go to your wireframe mode, just select the half of the mesh. I usually use vertices, and then I'll just use mirror subdivide or mirror modifier to mirror my mesh, so I don't have to unwrap each part of it, each side I mean. So I just have to unwrap one side, and that's another perk of having a pretty symmetrical character. The more symmetrical your character is going to be, the harder it's going to be for you to sculpt him, model him, and even animate him. So just think about that before you're starting on your character. I had some trouble here. I did manage to delete half of him, but there for some reason this selection disappeared. I had to redo it, but it doesn't take too much time, and it's worth when you're unwrapping. And for unwrapping, you can use other programs as well. I started using actually 3D Code. It works pretty well, but Blender works just fine, especially when you want to organize or when you want to work with your UV as islands. Blender is pretty good for that, and you'll see me doing that later. And here I missed some polygons, so I just add them manually. Fairly simple to do. And I usually start adding UV seams around his neck, around his ears. And when you're adding seams, it doesn't have to be an edge loop, it doesn't have to be perfect, as long as you make the selection wherever you need it. I just add a seam there at the top of his head, and add some. I'll also do it around this tentacle there, around this shoulder or around his arm. And when you're placing out your seams, you generally want to place them out, or you want to generally hide them as well as you can. But in some places it's pretty much impossible. But let's say you add the seam right here, you usually want to do it under his arm, not in front of his arm. So just think about that. And here I'm doing it on this blade. Pretty easy. Takes only, and this goes pretty fast. I think it took me about 5 minutes or 10 minutes max to unwrap them. And the more you do it, the more faster you become at it. You just know where you need to place these seams out. It becomes natural. So I usually have this front torso and back torso in separate islands, and then I'll also have this arm as one island, I think. And I typically separate the legs by his feet there, so I have separate islands for his leg and for his feet. Here I'm adding another seam, and as you can see, it's inside of his leg and not outside. So you want to hide your seams as best as you can. That's because if you notice them in game, it will be noticeable and it'll look bad. And sometimes you can't really avoid that on some seams, but when you can, you should do it. And here I'm unwrapped it, and I use minimize stretch to minimize some stretching on some islands. And that's why I like Blender. I like its UV tools quite a lot. It's really fast and it's really they're really good for me at least. And I usually separate the islands and start with the head, because you want the head to be pretty much your biggest UV island, since that's where you want your most detail. So that's usually, and then the body will be smaller than the head island, as you can see here. And you want to use as much UV space as you can too, so you get this, as much texture detail as possible. And you also want to think about your UV island proportion size. So actually you divide the density equally. Try to do this as best as you can, so you don't have, let's say, your torso has really high density but then your legs have really low density, and then the texture will just look bad on it. So no, just try to divide everything equally when it comes to size. And you know, except the head is exception. Usually want the head to be the biggest, but you know. And here I actually forgot to mark seams on my feet, so I had to do that. And you know, you can always, you're not really screwed when you're unwrapping your character. You know, you can just change the islands, you know, change your seams, and just unwrap each part separately, as you will see soon on the feet here. And I didn't have the mirror, so I had to do it on both feet, which could be annoying sometimes, but that was my fault. And here you just select the faces by pressing L on your feet there, and it'll select the foot by itself, and you can just press and wrap, and it'll only wrap the parts that you select on your mesh. So that's pretty good to know. Now I'll just try to placing them out as best as I can. You know, don't be afraid to rotate your islands. You can even have your head upside down, it doesn't really matter. Just make sure you use as much space as you can and have as much density as possible. Here I had some trouble, but I played around a bit and I managed to fit this in quite pretty decently. So now I also had some the eyes left, and the eyes are really simple. Just add a seam across the whole circle in the middle, like you see there, and then you just unwrap them. I'll give you 4 squares, you know, and then you can you need to actually combine your eye mesh with eyes mesh with your body. So you just select your body and then your eyes, and then you just press Control J. So Control J, and it'll combine the meshes together. So let's say you have some clothing as a separate mesh. You wanna make that clothing the same part of UV as your body. You know, you can just select the body and the clothing, and just join them together. And here I'm just checking the density to see if the density is divided okay, and it was pretty good, so I just went with it and exported my my mesh. And make sure you have selection only. And here I exported my high poly mesh, as you can see. And at this point we're pretty much ready to start baking our texture maps, which we'll do in the next part. So see you there. Thanks.